I had been a hunter for most of my life. Leading up to this incident, the smell of the warm air and the beauty of nature always had me at ease. I never felt scared alone at night because I have seen everything there is to be scared of. I have seen bears the size of a small car and animals so vicious they would kill anything that moved. The one thing I was never scared of was deer. I heard the tales of the skinwalker, the wendigo, and pretty much anything in between. My uncle was an expert in tracking and hunting. We always went on trips together and would always come back with a fresh kill. He had something about him. It was a rule. I remember it because it was weird. He never wanted to go hunting in winter. I never asked why. I'm not sure, but something about it always had me on edge. One day, it was winter, and I was about to go deer hunting when my uncle stopped at my front door. When he came in, he saw my packed supplies and my rifle, and knew I was about to go hunting. He immediately burst into a raft of anger as he dragged me to a wall and got into my face. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" His spit went all over my face as he looked at me crazy. He looked primal, as if he was fearful of something that he did not want to share. It was the same face you would expect a child to make if they were dumped in the middle of nowhere. The same face of fear that you see in people who have PTSD. I calmly brushed them off and got to the door saying I was gonna go hunting. I was not about to fight with my uncle and ruin this trip, as I hadn't gone hunting for close to a month. When you start hunting, you get adjusted to it, and then when you go on breaks, you actually miss it. As I got into my truck, my uncle peered at me out the window. He was there to take care of my house, but before I reversed, he left with the door open. My uncle is prone to outbursts, as I should mention. He's only ever done it a few times, and it's always in a situation where the reaction suits it. Not this one, however. What was so bad about hunting in the winter? The spot I had planned was an isolated one. It was a huge forest area, which I had not been to before. I obviously had mapped the area out and brought essential survival tools in case the worst came, but I never thought I would have to use it after all those years out in the forest. When I arrived, the crisp, cold air immediately saturated me in discomfort. I quickly got another layer of clothes on before I started to walk to where I would set up camp for the night. The clearing I had chosen was a pretty tight one. There was a big tree in the center that stood above the rest. It was called the forest star, which suited it. Around the clearing, the forest was extremely dense. Almost no sun shone through the top. There was a small hunting tower north of the entrance of the clearing, so it was a direct walk from camp. As I walked ahead, I noticed something. There were small droplets of blood littering the ground. My first thought was that it must have been an injured animal or something like that, but the droplets were small and almost even. I shook the thought out of my head and made it to my setup, and I started to pin my tent. When I was done, I checked my watch. It was around 5:30 p.m. I had around 2 hours for hunting before it was pitch black, and so I made it to the tower. When I undid my rifle from its case, I heard scampering. Shaking it off, I took my spot and waited. As I stood there, time almost slowed down. I was in a precise focus and was ready for anything. I wasn't ready for what I saw though. Out came 2 small bucks that seemed injured. There were small droplets of blood coming from their eyes. As I focused in, I saw that it wasn't dry blood. It was fresh, and it was oozing from their eyes. I was shocked. I had never seen anything like it. Many different scenarios ran through my head. I was thinking, had a hunter shot both of them in the eyes and managed to not kill them? but the scenarios I was coming up with seemed more unlikely than the last. I took aim at the closest one and shot it. It stood there for a second, just not moving. Then they trotted off as if nothing happened. Blood was running from the wound, so I know I had obviously hit it, but it didn't seem scared nor fazed. I decided that was enough and sort of jogged to my side. I was freaked out and decided that I would cook dinner and go to bed early. When I scampered around my pack, I pulled out a can of beans. I grabbed a pot and started a fire and began cooking them. As I cracked open a beer, the familiar sound of a branch snapping sounded off next to me. I thought it was maybe a small deer, and I brushed it off as I sat and relaxed. I was thinking about the deer, and I started to chalk it up to the fact I must have not hit it deep enough, and the deer must have been in shock. When I finished eating, I went to bed. I was shivering in the night cold, and I could feel my body shaking uncontrollably. As I dozed off after a brutal 2 hours of cold, I heard another snap. This time, however, it was more loud, like a bear. I immediately grabbed my rifle and went out of my tent. My fire burned low, and in the distance I saw 2 red lights. I walked towards it when my mind started to race. Something felt wrong. As I closed the distance, my gut was literally twisted. My mind was anxious and I felt like I was about to break down. Then I realized what was wrong. Those weren't lights. They were 2 big solid red eyes. They were just orbs hovering. When I realized, I stood frozen. I thought it was a big cat, but what emerged was so much worse. Its fur was black, darker than the night around us. Its antlers were twisted and uneven, but the worst part, it was crying blood. Deep red droplets were pelting down in its unnatural eyes. I couldn't make a sound. I was frozen in fear. Then it started to make sounds. The sounds of a baby crying. It was horrible. The sounds of unnatural cries filled the cold air, making it worse. My body felt crumple, and so I finally broke out into a sprint. When I looked back, it stood there. It wasn't even breathing, but the sounds of that baby crying weren't fading. It was like a speaker was attached to my ear. When I made it back to camp, I rushed to pack my stuff. In a hurry, I ran, leaving the tent behind, and I rushed to my truck. As I fumbled with the keys, I saw that something was walking slowly towards me. That's when the whispering started. Terrible, faint voices echoed throughout the forest. As my mind started to close, I felt my cerebral melting, as anything I tried to do would not happen. It was like sleep paralysis. As I stood there, I found the strength to finally open the door and get in my car. I slammed the door shut, and that thing was right at the window. I started to sob as I jammed the keys in the ignition. My mind felt fried as I swerved out of there. I didn't care if I hit anything. I just wanted to be away from that thing. And then, before I could back out, it stood up on its legs, and it repeated a voice I recognized.
You do not escape. The forest are mine.
It was my grandpa's voice. He died when I was 6, and I never knew any of the details. The thing then made a terrible shrieking noise that hurt my entire body. As it did so, I heard scampering as more of those things came out. They had blood running from their eyes as well. The baby cry started again, and that's when I finally drove out of that fucking place. When I raced home, I barged into the door. My shoulder ached, but I didn't care. I shoved my door and locked it and ran into my kitchen. That's when I saw my uncle sitting at the table, enjoying a small glass of scotch. So, you saw what I saw, didn't you, Anthony? I couldn't form a single word. I was so shocked. My uncle came up to me and said, "What you saw out there is my rule that I abide by. There are things in those forests in winter that are so horrible that even the most seasoned can't handle it. I saw it when I was a boy, and since then, I will never go hunting during winter." I finally mustered a sentence. What was it? He took a small sip before sitting me down. "You saw something called Herberak. It's an old, ancient being that dwells in the forest during these winters. Hunters who see it never are the same again, but some never even come home. I was lucky." My uncle sort of sniffled as he told me about his encounter with Herberak when I was 23. My father and I went out into the woods on a very cold winter to hunt. Our family was struggling, so we didn't have much food. When we were hunting, my father called out to me, but before I could even get to him, I heard him yell out before he fell silent. I never saw him again, but what stood there was worse than the loss of my own. A deer with red eyes, black fur, and twisted antlers stood there. Blood was running from its eyes. Then it started to cry like a baby. My uncle stopped and had to take a second before continuing. I comforted him as I was teary-eyed. It ran after me, Anthony, on 2 legs. It was like a human, and I rushed to get away from it. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal a terrible red scar that ran across the entire underside of his arm. It was trying to feast on me. It knew I feared it, but eventually I managed to lose it. He finally finished his scotch before continuing. I was stuck in the forest for 3 days, fighting to survive. I heard its cries and whispers all around. As I tried to make it out, I finally arrived at a road and was taken in by the police. No trace was found of my father, except for one thing. They found blood at the scene and tested it. It belonged to my father. What was strange about it, it was mixed with his tears. Then my uncle finally stood up. "Fear it, for it now knows who you are." Those were his last words. He left my house and the police found him wrapped up in a noose 2 days later. It broke me. My hunting buddy and best friend was gone. There was one detail about his suicide that was never resolved. He had droplets of blood coming from his eyes. The coroner's inspection said it was an aneurysm, but I'm not sure that is the truth. I'm 50 years old now, and I haven't been hunting in 2 decades. I can't even go into the forest anymore. I'm thinking about going back and seeing what Herberak is. Maybe I can kill him. So beware of Herberak, for he lurks in the forest, out in the cold. I love camping, but after my most recent trip, I don't think it will ever be the same. I set up my tent on nice, flat ground and collected some wood for a fire. The night came with all its nightly sounds, and I relaxed at the owls and chirping crickets. Even better was the fact that no one else was around. Help. It was subtle. I almost missed it. The voice came from deep within the woods, and for a moment, I didn't believe what I was hearing. It sounded almost like a female, but strange enough, I just couldn't tell. Please help. It continued. I shined my flashlight between the bushes and walked around. To be completely honest, even as a grown man, I was paralyzed with fear. So, I did the responsible thing and called the local police. That's when things went from being odd to very, very weird. The police actually told me to ignore it. I explained to them that someone could be injured and maybe needed medical attention, but they assured me otherwise. When I kept pushing and asked why, they told me, "Sir, if you ever hear that voice again, ignore it, do not respond, and do not approach." Well, I did hear it again, but I didn't ignore it. It was almost midnight when I heard the voice a second time. I awoke to someone whispering, "Help," and it sounded like she was just outside my tent. I went outside to check and no one was there, but the voice continued from a distance. "Help, please." Again, I grabbed my flashlight and looked around the area I was camping. I was too afraid to follow the voice into the woods, especially since the authorities themselves avoided it. But I struggled morally, trying to decide whether I should go and help this person or listen to the police, who were concerned for my safety. But then, I heard another, different voice. This other voice, which also seemed to be coming from the woods, was an octave lower. Unlike the first one, which cried for help, this one was loud and demanding.
Quiet.
The other voice demanded.
No one's going to help you.
Once I heard that, I was pretty sure someone was in trouble, so I called the police again. When I informed them about a second voice coming from the woods, they seemed even more concerned. They told me that I should pack up my things and leave the campsite immediately. They said that hearing the second, more manly voice meant that it was getting desperate. They also said that the two voices were coming from the same person. That part was bizarre and confused me, to say the least. It was at this point I dismissed the police in that area as crazy, but not before telling them off. I got angry. I told them that if they didn't get down here to come and check it out, then I would do it myself. I said that a woman could be in serious trouble and that it was their job to help her, but they still refused to come. All they kept repeating to me over the phone was, "Do not enter the woods, sir." They actually seemed more afraid than I was. Once I hung up the phone, I heard the voices again. A gentle, "Please, somebody help me." And then, a growling,
Quiet. No one's coming.
It was a little past midnight at that point. I couldn't live with myself knowing that I had the chance to save someone's life, but instead became a coward. So I grabbed some things and ventured into the woods. When I entered the woods, the voices ceased. Just like that. No cries, no whispers, and no commands. Even the owls and crickets went away. Nothing but dancing leaves and creaking tree branches. I stopped walking and looked around, a full 360 degrees. "Hello? Anyone here?" I called out. Nothing. "I'm here to help," I continued. "Where are you? Are you okay?" Still, nothing. I thought of calling the police again, then chuckled to myself. I found it strange, but somewhat comforting that I didn't find anyone out there. Regardless, I was still creeped out, so I packed my things and finally left the campsite. I didn't know why the police, of all people, were so afraid. Worst case, someone was in actual danger, and we all failed them. To be honest though, when I heard the voice the very first time, I did think it was a joke. When I heard it the second time, along with that other voice, I became a bit more concerned. And same with the third time I heard it in the woods. However, when I heard it again, for the fourth time, a week after I left the campsite, coming from inside my own house, I became very, very concerned. I was the first to notice an extra person had joined our group. I counted 6 of us sitting around the campfire, but I knew we had left home with 5. The 6th person had joined us somewhere along the way, but where and when exactly, I could not be sure. All the glowing faces looked familiar, like I had known them all for a lifetime. That was why it took so long to find the man out of place. I had to go through the faces one by one. I went through my history with them, recounting how I met them, how I knew them. I fit each one into my memories like puzzle pieces. First, there was Mark. He was sitting next to Sarah, talking with her as always. I met Mark and Sarah 6 years ago in the 10th grade. Mark and I played wide receiver together on the school football team. Sarah was a cheerleader, and Mark always had a thing for her. The 3 of us started hanging out after games, Mark flirting non-stop, and Sarah always hilariously rebuking him after a while. Then there was Ben. We had been best friends since the 1st grade, ever since we bumped heads playing tag during recess. He had his arm around his longtime girlfriend, Justine. She started at our school when she moved from Chicago in the 7th grade. Ben sat next to her in class, and soon she became a part of our group at that time. She was quiet and shy when she first arrived, but once we got to know her, she opened up. She was one of the coolest and nicest people you could ever get to meet. She had also become close with Sarah in the past few years. And then, there was the 6th face. The piece that did not fit. I stared at him, and his name escaped me. That is, if I ever had it in my memory banks in the first place. He looked familiar, but I could not place him in my memories. But why, if I recognized him? Why could I not remember his name? Why did he sit among us, acting as if he belonged here? He stared at Mark and Sarah as they chatted. He started laughing when they would laugh, smile when they smiled. I couldn't figure it out. The question burned in my head. How had he, a stranger, joined our little group without any of us noticing something amiss? Hey Porter, Ben pulled me from my thoughts. Your head up in the clouds or something? I was just telling Justine about our 5th grade teacher. What was his name again? Mr. Smith, I said. Oh yeah, Mr. Smith. I was telling Justine how you could rile that guy up like nobody else could. Remember that one time you gave your homework printed in yellow ink? Ben and Justine laughed. Yeah, I remember, I said. I can still see the steam coming out of his ears. They laughed again, and I semi-joined in. When I glanced the strange man's way, he was watching us, grinning, just watching, part of the reason he had flown under the radar. I was struck with the sense that he was studying us. My skin started to crawl. Ben drained his beer and threw the empty can in the cooler. Well, I gotta take a leak, he said and walked into the woods, swallowed up by the darkness. You really know how to push people's buttons when you want to, huh? Justine said. I shrugged. I was having trouble focusing on the conversation. The weight of the situation, the reality of it, was starting to hit me. A strange man had attached himself to our group unnoticed, and who the fuck knew what his motivations were? Questions raced through my mind, none I could answer. How had no one else noticed yet? Why had it taken me so long to notice? Was I going insane? Am I forgetting things and forgot this one friend of ours? The strange man then stood with jerkiness. I gotta take a leak, he said. It was the first time I heard him speak. He spoke in a strange way. It sounded as if he had to force the words from his throat. He walked with an awkward gait, and like Ben, disappeared behind the dark veil of the trees. No one else flinched. Justine kept talking. I always loved the long relationship you and Ben have. It was so hard moving cities and leaving all my old friends behind. I mean, I can't complain too much. I wouldn't have met Ben and all you guys otherwise. Justine, don't you see what's going on here? Huh? You're telling me you haven't noticed? Notice what, Porter? What are you talking about? Who was that guy? I gestured to the vacated spot the strange man left behind. Oh, him? He's, what's his name? She trailed off. She frowned into the fire. I could see her mind ticking over, and her eyes twinkle with concern. I knew I wasn't going crazy. I don't know, she said. Who is it? That's what I'm trying to figure out. We stared at each other. Maybe... Justine was cut off. An ear-piercing screech came from the woods. It sounded like a shrill, injured cat. A large cat. The sound split in the air and cut our conversations short. A blanket of silence fell over the four of us. Only the crackling campfire persisted. The woods were still and quiet. The fuck was that? Mark broke the silence. I don't know, Sarah said. I have never quite heard an animal like that before. Sounded like some fucked up mountain lion, Justine said. Have you ever heard anything like that before? I shook my head. My fingers tingled with adrenaline. Ben was still in the woods, and the strange man was out there with them. Dread filled my gut. There's no mountain lions out here, Mark said. Most likely an elk. They can make some creepy sounds. Sarah agreed. Justine bit her lip and scanned the woods. It's okay. I think Mark's right, I said to her, but I wasn't sure I believed it. Mark and Sarah had started up their conversation again when the strange man came out of the woods. They paid him no mind. I was hoping something would have triggered in them by now, but they were oblivious. The strange man took a beer from the cooler. He fumbled with it, struggling with the tab. It was as if he had never opened the can before. When he finally got it open, he sat, beer in hand, and continued to watch Mark and Sarah, a thin smile on his face. He never did take a sip. I watched them from across the campfire, his head wavering behind the heat. I touched on what made me uneasy about this strange man, aside from the fact that he had managed to infiltrate our group without any of us noticing for a long time. He moved with jerkiness and awkwardness, like a newborn animal. Nothing he did was well practiced. It made everything he did look like an act, an imitation. I didn't make the connection at the time, but I should have seen this man was not quite human. But at the moment I wasn't sure what to think. I guess I just thought he was a freak. I considered calling him out, then and there. I wanted to ask him just what the fuck he was doing, but I'll admit, I was a little scared. I had visions of this guy being some horrific serial killer, and I didn't know how dangerous he was, or if he was armed. I didn't want to push him into doing something drastic that got all of us killed. As time went by without any sign of Ben, I became convinced the strange man had done something to him. I watched them plan and marking his next target. Anger sprouted from my fear, and I started to see red. I needed to stop him. We used an axe to chop firewood for our campfire, and it was leaning against my seat. This man was dangerous. I was sure of it. I convinced myself I needed to do something before another one of us was next. I clutched at the axe's handle. Justine touched my arm. "Porter, where's Ben? I'm getting nervous." "It's okay," I lied, patting her hand. "I'm sure everything is okay." I stood with the axe in hand. "I'm gonna go get some more firewood," I announced, more awkward than I hoped. Okay, dude," Mark said. "Porter?" Justine's voice. Speaking up was a mistake. I had drawn the attention of the strange man. I walked past him, trying to act as nonchalant as possible, but I was never a good actor. He watched me the whole way. He kept his glare on me as I reached the area of the woods, and as he looked back, his head rotated around an unnatural distance. That was enough to chill my spine. I was hoping he would turn around to look away and give me an opening, but he never did. I'm not exactly sure what happened next. I never saw him stand up and walk over to me. I never even saw him move a single muscle. But just like that, in an instant, he was standing in front of me, inches away from my face. It was as if he had teleported. A metallic smell stung my nose. The strange man stunk of blood and copper. The axe trembled in my hand. Any thought of actually using it fled my mind. I locked into place, my skin covered in goosebumps. Power radiated off of him. He spoke to me.
"Get some firewood,"
he said in his forced tone, and he smiled wide. At that moment, Ben emerged from the woods. "Ben," Justine cried. "Jesus," Ben said as Justine squeezed him. "Did you guys hear that cat thing?" "We think it was an elk," Mark said. "Where were you? Why did you take so long?" Justine asked. "I guess I wandered too far off, and I lost sight of the campfire. It took me a bit to find my way back. For a second I thought I was going to have to freeze my ass off out there alone tonight." The relief washed over my body like a wave, crashing into my muscles. I felt each one relax. At least Ben was safe. I looked for the strange man, but he was gone. He somehow slinked away while I was distracted. He was good at going undetected when he wanted to. My thoughts turned to getting out of there. Even though Ben was unharmed, that guy was still trouble. I started back towards the group and caught the middle of their conversation. "Yeah, who was that guy?" Ben said. "I thought he was with you guys," Sarah said. "Yeah, isn't he your friend?" Mark added. "I thought he drove over with you three." No," Ben said. "I don't know him." The panic spread over everyone's faces. They were finally feeling what I was feeling. The realization had set in. "We need to get out of here," I said, "before he comes back." "Yes, please," Justine said. "We have to leave now. That guy was a freak, right, Porter?" I explained to them how I noticed he was the odd man out when we were sitting around the campfire. I explained the odd behavior, and they all agreed the guy was strange and possibly dangerous. None of us could pinpoint exactly when he had joined the group. He had slipped unnoticed and unaccounted for. It was strange. We packed our tents in record time. We trekked the 15 minutes to our vehicles through dark woods, flashlights in hand. We heard the screech of the elk again, if it was an elk, which I had my doubts about now, and we took some comfort from the fact it sounded further away. Even so, we picked up our pace for the final stretch of the walk. I felt like I could finally relax behind the wheel and locked doors of my SUV. Justine and Ben sat in the back, while Mark and Sarah followed behind us, in Mark's old beaten-up vehicle. We were heading out of the woodland, and were planning to shack up in a motel for the night, before heading home in the morning. I thought we were free and clear. We worked our way around the dark roads that snaked through woods. I let a smile open up my face when we finally reached the exit road. It was an arrow-straight stretch of asphalt that split through the last few miles of woodland. I pressed on the gas. I couldn't wait to get the hell out of the woods, and I think Mark was feeling the same way, because he sat close on my rear bumper. I remember thinking, at least we'll have a strange tale to tell after all this. I didn't think it was about to turn into a horror story. The trees and the dashed lines on the road blurred past us. My headlights reached out for the endless road, and my meter needled its way towards 100 miles per hour. I don't know what possessed me to go that fast, and I wish Mark hadn't followed my lead. It was a mistake. The strange man appeared from behind a tree. He walked into the middle of my lane. I slammed the brakes, but it was too late. The next sequence of events happened so fast it plays like a slideshow in my mind. The tires screeched and there was a smell of burning rubber. The strange man folded over my vehicle and got sent flying down the road. He skated across the pavement on his back, moving with such speed it looked like he was gliding on ice. More tires screeching. Mark flew past in the opposite lane, fishtailing. He fought it, and for a moment I thought he had it saved, but the vehicle hooked right into the trees. The sickening sound of crunching metal sounded in the air. Mark's car slammed into a tree, driver's side first, sending fragments of glass and metal flying. The car bounded off one tree and into another. The front passenger side impacted this time. The front light exploded, and the passenger side cavity caved in, sending a wheel bounding into the woods. The crumpled heap of a car came to a rest. Justine was the first out the door, crying out Sarah's name. Ben went after her, and I followed after him. Everything felt surreal as shock coursed through my body. It was as if I was watching through a screen. I floated over the asphalt as Justine and Ben sprinted towards the streaming wreckage. The crash seemed dimly lit by my SUV's one remaining headlight. There are two screams I'll never forget. They imprinted themselves on my brain, and I'm gonna hear their echoes at night forever. The first one I heard was when I was 13. It came from my mother. It flooded the house, splashing off the walls. I ran out of my room to see her crumple at the front door, with two police officers standing by. They had notified her that her eldest son, my brother, had died. The second came from Justine when she saw what was waiting for us in the vehicle. Mark was unrecognizable. He was a shattered mess of bone, skin, and blood, blended and intertwined with the crumpled steel. Sarah was blinking slowly, her breathing labored, her one arm shattered, broken in too many pieces to count. Her legs crushed at knees from the front of the vehicle, which crumpled back into her leg space. Her legs would have been flat if I could see them. Justine turned away and fell to her knees, with her face buried in her hands. Ben tried to comfort her, but he had to turn away and throw up on the side of the road. I pulled out my phone and struggled to dial 911. With my fingers shaking, I kept pressing the wrong numbers. My voice was small and distant as I explained what happened to the operator. She told me to stay on the line, but as I looked down the road, I dropped my phone. The strange man was standing there. His grin reached from ear to ear, showing a grandstand of his teeth. His shoulders shrugged up and down as if he was laughing. In fact, the fucker was laughing. If I were not in shock, I would have gone after him right there and then. I would have torn his heart, if he has one, right from its chest. But all I could do was stare, struggling to keep the tears behind my eyes. The strange man started for the woods. I watched them go, and I watched them change. I saw it. I know I did. This was no illusion, no trick of the mind. This was real. I saw him. Shapeshift. I saw. It's true. Form. We were not dealing with something human that night. After countless hours of research, I believe I saw what others have called the goat man. Its horns were sticking out, uneven from its head, with rows of sharp teeth, and walking upright, like a man, with an awkward gait. It vanished into the shrouded woods. It's been 8 months since that night. I've only seen my friends a handful of times since then. Our relationships have shattered and are left in ruin. All we are now to each other is a stark reminder of that night. Mark is dead. Sarah survived, but as a triple amputee. Justine and Ben broke up. And here I am, rugged with a scraggly beard and hair that has been uncut, after spending every sleepless night researching this monster I saw that night, the goat man. I'm going back to those woods. I'm coming for the goat man, and I'm not stopping until one of us is dead. I grew up in K-Town on the res. One of the guys I knew in school was named Daniel. He was a true jokester. Never a serious moment, always pulling pranks. One day I see him in the cafeteria, and I go sit at his table cause it looks like he's troubled. I sat down and was like, "Hey, what's up?" The interrupted story that poured out of him terrified me. Daniel said that he was up at a family sheep camp. He said he was there alone when a coyote that looked as large as a bear came out of hiding behind some pine trees. It looked at Daniel, smiled, and said,
"I'm going to get you, Daniel."
Daniel said that when he heard this, he almost peed on himself and ran close to 13 miles back to town as fast as he could. He said that by the time he reached town, it was dark, and he could hear the coyote yelling far behind him.
"I'm gonna get you, Daniel."
He made it home, jumped in bed and stayed awake in fright for the rest of the night. Then, he said that throughout the night, he could hear that same voice outside his window.
"I'm gonna get you, Daniel."
He told me the story the next day. It was up to that point the only time I had encountered Daniel to be completely stone cold serious. I offer that maybe one of the medicine men in town can help him. But Daniel was done with the subject from then on. I'm gonna log off till tomorrow night. You all can message me there if anyone is interested in knowing more about this. Let me give you some advice if you ever go camping in the woods, in the middle of nowhere, or even near the Navajo res. The smell of copper and blood means there is a skinwalker near. My grandfather told me a story once. He said how he went camping in the woods with 5 friends, and they sat around a fire. He nonchalantly counted heads, and there were 6 of them. And he said there was a copper smell in the air. And after a while, they went into the camper, and the 6th guy stood over every one and stared at them for hours. And as he was awake, the whole time he was debating on doing something. But he said that eventually this 6th guy just ended up leaving them. My grandfather then said that he didn't go back to sleep, and that he told his friends the next morning, and they decided to pack up everything and leave. My grandfather tells me that skinwalkers will usually approach you, study you, watch your behavior, in order to blend in with your group when you're out in the woods. So be careful out there if you ever go camping with a group of friends. As you're sitting around the campfire, sleeping, having fun, drinking a beer, always count those who are around you. Make sure nobody or something sneaks in. When we first moved into my grandpa's old cabin, I had a few obvious reasons to be afraid. First of all, I was 12 years old. Second, we moved in because our old house had burned down while we were away on vacation. And finally, my grandpa was a sick, old man. Not in the sense that he had some sort of illness. Well, I suppose he did. But that illness is what ended up killing him, giving us that forsaken cabin. But in the sense that he was batshit insane. When I was younger, my grandfather would tell me horrible stories about the cabin he lived in and the woods around it. He would tell me stories of the natives who lived in the forest, something about them being cursed by God for worshipping false gods, being turned into the trees themselves, if you look closely, while not looking at all. My sadistic grandpa would say that you can still see the trees move, and if you listen carefully, you could even hear them singing their worship for their false gods. I, of course, assumed he was just crazy and was trying to scare me from wandering off in the woods, and possibly also to motivate me to go to church. But still, since I was 8 freaking years old and all, I would sometimes see a branch twitch in the wind, or hear the faint noise of a distant animal, and I would worry it was one of the natives that my grandpa would go crazy over. But of course, the stories didn't finish there. Not only was this cabin the original home to a clan of witches, but also home to a cannibal and at least 2 serial killers, and a family that used to worship the devil. To make the whole illusion complete, my grandpa made up a story how he won the cabin in a game of Russian roulette against one of the previous owners. All of these stories never truly scared me. They terrified me when I thought about one of them too much, but I was actually never fearful of the stories being true. Well, except for one story that my grandfather told me. He said before the cabin was built that the natives used the area for human sacrifices, offering up human flesh and blood not only for their gods, but for creatures they believed that dwelled in the woods. These creatures, my grandfather would say, were known by many names in all kinds of folklore: Wendigos, the Jersey Devil, demons, White Walkers, Skinwalkers, the Goat Man. But my grandpa would always call them Marcheur de Poule. It's French for skinwalker. These beings of divine or mystical power were known to feed off anything from human flesh and blood to a human soul, or even fear itself. The skinwalker would stalk their prey throughout the woods they inhabited. If the sacrifice given was not enough to feed their hunger, they always attacked groups of people never a single person. That's the reason why my grandfather said that he lived alone. The skinwalkers would play with their food, often turning their form to look human to trick and torment anyone they sought to feed off, before finally killing them. My grandfather said once they finished feeding off of anyone unlucky enough, they would peel the skin from bone and wear it like a suit, often visiting the families of the dead to further torment mankind. The reason the story scared me so much was because I truly believed I saw one. When I was 8, I was playing in the backyard of the cabin. My grandfather sitting on the back porch, smoking his pipe and humming some old tune. He told me he was going to go inside and fetch some more tobacco, and he warned me not to go too close to the woods. I nodded and kept doing whatever I was doing at the time. After a few minutes, I felt the air around me turn cold, and everything seemed to get heavier, and I began to smell something like pennies, and the cold grew stronger. I realized it smelled exactly like blood. I felt a chill run up my spine, and I nearly gagged on the metallic taste that lingered in my mouth. I was about to stand and move back inside the cabin when I heard a soft laugh faintly beyond the tree line. I realized it sounded just like my own laugh, but now I was already scared. So scared I could hardly move at all. The smell of copper grew so strong that I thought I might pass out. But then, just out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I swallowed my spit and slowly turned to see a little boy standing just in front of the forest. I was almost relieved until I saw his eyes. They were pure white with no pupil, just pure white. I felt my knees buckle under me and my lip began to quiver when it smiled at me. But when it smiled, the teeth were missing, and it was just a set of black, rotting gums that I could smell from several yards away. It lurked ahead, doubling over, seeming to hack and gag and laugh all at the same time. Then, it bent backward, placing its hands on the ground, and looked at me from between its legs. I swear I could hear bones break and crack as it began to crawl backwards into the forest, all the while making this gagging, laughing sound. That's when I passed out and wet my pants. I woke up a few minutes later from my grandfather gently shaking me up. The smell had magically disappeared, and there was no evidence of the creature I had saw just a few minutes ago. I told my grandfather what I had saw, and he grew so pale he almost looked like the little boy's eyes. He drove me back to my house, not saying a word the whole way. I told my parents what happened, and I was assured I must have just fell asleep and dreamed the whole thing. So eventually, that's what I convinced myself had happened. It still haunted my dreams, but I was convinced it was my imagination, and my grandfather's old stories were just getting to me. But then, we moved into my grandfather's cabin. Since we had lost all of our belongings in the fire, we had nothing to unpack. Even though I had convinced myself that I dreamed what I saw all those years ago, I was still worried about living there for an extended period of time. My parents let me watch some movies we rented while they were cleaning the cabin that had been vacant since my grandfather died when I was 10. Eventually, I dozed off. I woke up on the couch a bit surprised I had fallen asleep for so long. As I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, I became aware of the tapping that was coming from the front door, almost as if someone was knocking with their fingertips. Even though I had no real idea what it was, I got up to check on it. Then, I smelled it again, that heavy, thick, bloody smell that had lingered in the back of my mind for 4 years. It got so cold so fast I could see my own breath. I felt my heart thumping in my chest, and that same shiver run up my spine. I was so scared in that moment I thought I was going to break down and start crying. Then the tapping stopped. Then the smell grew worse. Beyond the front door, I heard something gag and cough and laugh at the same time. My knees buckled and my lip quivered just like they did the first time. I became vaguely aware that I was slowly backing away from the door when I tripped and fell back onto the couch. Then I passed out again. Again, like the first time, I woke up from a hand gently shaking me away. I woke up and realized it was my dad looking down at me. It looked like he was out of breath, but I was so relieved he was there, and that the tapping on the door was all a dream. I then smiled at him, and he tried to do the same, but he only managed to get one side of his lips curled up. I was about to ask what was wrong when he scooped me up in his arms and told me in a hoarse voice that he was carrying me to my bed. His arms were so cold they felt like metal, but I didn't care, and I was already falling asleep again. He brought me to my room and laid me down in bed. His eyes were already closed and my mind was about to drift off. He leaned down and I felt his cold breath on my ear as my mind shut down and he pulled away, and just before I fell back into sweet sleep, I heard my dad begin to cough. A few hours passed and I woke up again. I grew scared when I remembered the tapping on the door, but soon felt better when I remembered that it must have been a dream, and was thankful my dad woke me up to carry me to my room. I sat up in bed, still just a bit scared. I looked around my room, realizing that this was the first time I actually seen it since I had fallen asleep on the couch, before I even had a chance to check out my new room. It was almost pitch black, so I could hardly see anything. I gazed over to the wall and saw a mirror. It was hard to see, but I could make out my face and my upper body. I smiled at myself and saw my reflection smile back at me. Satisfied, I went back to sleep. In the morning, my dad again gently shook me awake. He said good morning and asked what I wanted for breakfast. I told him what I wanted and then thanked him for carrying me to the bed the night before. He looked at me, confused, and told me that he didn't, but I wasn't listening anymore, because when I looked at the wall, just as I had looked at it last night, I realized there wasn't a mirror in my room, only a window. Do you love Native American legends? Have you heard of the Goat Man? No? Then please, allow me to enlighten you. I heard the legend when a power outage on our reservation made us decide to have a fire. As we all know, nothing goes better with a good fire than a good story. That's where I learned about the Goat Man. The legend goes that they shapeshift. They love human forms most of all, which is what makes them so dangerous. It's also said that if you find a bone of one, take a picture and keep it in your house. It will wait. For what though, you may ask? The answer is they wait for you to leave. Once you leave, they ransack the place until they find what you took from them. There was even an incident about that night that I heard of, where some people met the Goat Man face to face. It was a night like the one I was experiencing. Some men had decided to have a fire in the desert, and they told some stories about it. Then a stranger walked out of the desert and took a seat, never speaking a word. No one really got a good look at the stranger. One man brought up the legend of the Goat Man, causing the stranger to listen a little more closely. At the end, the other men nervously laughed, and the stranger stayed silent. The man decided to go back to their homes and put out the fire. They didn't have enough room for the stranger, and they figured he could hitchhike back to town. They had just left when they saw something chasing after their truck. Afraid, they sped up, and the creature sped up its pursuit as well. When it reached the truck, it flipped over and dragged 3 men off into the night. What happened to them? Well, they were never found. So here I am, to warn you, and to be careful of the goat man. They can shapeshift, didn't I tell you? That homeless man begging for change that you encounter on your way home tonight could be one, or your boss, teacher, or even your friend. This happened about a week and a half ago. I live in Washington State. I'm a 14-year-old male. I'm homeschooled, so I don't leave the house much, and I live with my mom and my dad. It was March 7, 2022, at about 12 a.m. I was just listening to the old Jenna Marbles and Julianne podcast from like 3 years ago and playing some video games. I was kind of tired, and I had just finished eating a snack, so I went to go brush my teeth and wash my face. I did all my business in the bathroom and came back to my room. When I opened the door, my cat was up in his cat tower, which is right next to my window, and his back was arched up. His hair on his back was all up, and he was hissing, which I had never heard him do. I look out the window, and standing there is my dad. This gave me a relief for a second, until I realized it wasn't my dad. It was taller than my dad, and its smile was weirdly big. My dad never just smiles at me, and he's never came up to my window before. What the fuck is that? I said as I ran out my room, crying and shaking, obviously, because I never seen anything like that before. I went to my mom, who was sleeping on the couch, and I shook her awake. I told her to go check if my dad was in the bedroom, and she asked why. And I told her I would tell her after she checked, and indeed, he was sleeping in the bedroom. I told her what happened, and she sort of believed me, but sort of didn't. So she went into my room and checked out my window. Whatever it was gone. She checked all the other windows and doors, and nothing was there. She even grabbed my cat, and we slept on the couch that night, all together. Today was the first day I was able to go back into my room, March 17th, and I still haven't told my dad about it. I have no idea what it was that I saw, but the only thing I can think of is that it was a skinwalker. Anyway, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget this, and I'm still terrified that I'm gonna end up seeing it again. It's crazy. I looked behind my shoulder like 10 times while writing this. What the fuck? Two years ago, I went to go visit family up in North Minnesota around Labor Day weekend. I won't give the exact location, but will provide at least a general location where this happened. To keep it short, I'm hoping someone may have had similar experience, or may have had a general idea what this thing or entity was walking around our tent. On that Labor Day weekend, my girlfriend and I were planning on spending time camping with her family. Both of us were very excited to get away from the everyday city life, and we anticipated a much needed low-key weekend. We arrived at their location around noon on Saturday, and were all greeted by everyone there. During the day and evening, we were enjoying ourselves with random fun activities, and catching up on how everyone was doing. As the night started to settle in, we were all near the campfire for a few hours until 11 p.m. Eventually, the family and ourselves called it a night. and we all headed to bed. My girlfriend and I were offered to sleep in a bigger size 6-person tent. It belonged to a relative who I will call Mary. It was a kind gesture at that time, as we only brought a 2-person sized tent. Having that additional space for our belongings and our air mattress was a nice added feature. Mary's tent was positioned not too far from the campfire and the rest of the family. The family did a wonderful job clearing and maintaining the area for their smaller RVs and additional tents. To the back of the tent, about 20 to 30 yards, is where the woods started with semi-thick brush and trees. Us 3 were laying down chatting, and eventually they both fell asleep. For some reason though, I couldn't sleep, so I was on my phone passing time, hoping to eventually drift off to sleep. This is when I heard a faint noise in the woods about 40 yards back. I dismissed it right away, as deer are known in this area, and I continued to space off on my phone looking at random things. About 10 to 20 minutes later, I heard something get closer to our tent. I could hear twigs snapping and moving between bushes getting closer to our area. This started to get my attention, as I could start physically feeling a faint shake in the ground as this thing was wandering around. Moments later, this thing was about 10 yards away from our area, walking, running back and forth. Whatever this thing was, with each step it took, I could physically feel the vibration from the ground. This thing was big, and the best way to describe this feeling is if you went to a live rock concert and you felt the kick drum hit your body. At this point, I was a bit terrified, as I was trying to follow the footsteps, walking or running at the back and the side of the tent. This thing got at least 5 yards near our area, and then suddenly it stopped where Mary was sleeping at, near her tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, scared of what this thing was going to do next. I shit you not, a few seconds later, Mary shot up from being dead asleep. She gasped for air and was calling our names to wake us up. You could hear her voice. She was terrified. This thing hightailed off back into the woods. Both of us were very startled at this point. The woods had become dead silent, and eventually we got enough courage to look outside. We saw and heard nothing, and about 30 minutes later, we ran to the shop to grab a shotgun. Another anomaly during this whole thing, while we were alert and awake, Mary mentioned during this time I was awake that she was having a dream. She mentioned these things were tormenting her, saying they wanted her soul and to give it to them. My girlfriend dismissed the whole thing and said it was most likely just a deer, etc., running around. After hearing my girlfriend say that, I never told anyone about this story until recently, as I started to think about it again, trying to figure out what the hell this thing or entity was. I am Navajo. We had an incident with an unwelcome visitor in our home. Here's what happened. My cousin is sleeping over. He's the same age as me. We're both 13 at this time. We're in my room, talking and hanging out. It is around maybe 11 p.m. It is a pleasant summer evening, so my window is wide open. It's also pretty dark outside, and my dad is in the living room watching TV. But as always, he's dozed off on the couch. My mom has already gone to bed. My cousin and I are keeping it down, but we're not ready yet to call it a night. All of a sudden, we hear the screen door to the front of the house open and slam shut. We think it's my dad. My mom, she tells us the next day she hears footsteps on the carpet. Whoever it is, she says, goes through her room and towards the bathroom, so she naturally assumes it's my dad. Then she realizes that she's unable to move, as if she's paralyzed. Still, in my room, my cousin and I again hear the screen door open and slam, only this time more loud. It wakes up my dad, and he comes to my bedroom to check on us. Finding us both there, he wants to know which one of my friends just slipped out of the house. It takes a few minutes, but we convince him we were by ourselves, and that we thought it was him going in and out. I can see by the look on his face, he's not really buying it, but he has to admit we don't seem to be lying. He then leaves, and as he's closing the door to my room, he tells us to stay out of trouble and go to sleep. All we could do is shrug. The next morning, my mom tells us about what she heard and how she could not move. She also tells us that the second time the door slams, she then hears what sounds like a horse galloping by her bedroom window. She then has all of us pray, and now, every year, we hike up the mountain to a high point and we pray for protection from evil. This event happened just south of Polaca, Arizona, within the Navajo reservation. A pair of skinwalkers, they say an old couple that lived deep back in the reservation, were seen lurking around this small cattle ranch. 2 heifers had disappeared recently, one of which was discovered down by the creek and mutilated. The man who owned the ranch, his 2 sons, and his brother armed themselves and went out to try to run them off. One of the sons, not yet 18 years of age, was searching out beyond the barn when a dark shape, materializing from the darkness itself, loomed up in front of him, almost nose to nose. As the boy attempted to raise his rifle, the figure raised its hands up to its face as if it was going to yell something. The boy, trying not to look at it in the eyes, then felt something rush into his face, like dust or sand. Even though he tried not to, he ended up taking a breath, and some of it was inhaled in. Immediately, things went dark, and he started experiencing hallucinations. The others found him only minutes later, on his knees, holding the sides of his head, and his eyes rolled back. He fell to the ground and went into some sort of trance. His body limp, and he became unresponsive. They carried him back to the house, and they summoned the local medicine man, who came and said some prayers over him, but he told the others there was nothing to be done but to wait for the dust, traces of which were still on his face, and his shirt to wear off. He promised he would come back the next day when the sun was up and bless the Hogan. Later, after he had regained consciousness, the boy swore to the others that he was the victim of a dog-faced creature. He described it as not quite as tall as he is, thin and scraggly, with patches of mangy and dark hair, a canine snout only shorter than a dog's, and with the smell of rotten eggs or worse. He said he doesn't recall anything more before passing out, other than not being able to breathe and having no control over his own body. I was only 17 at the time. On this specific night, I woke up feeling thirsty. I'm just lying there, staring into the dark, and deciding if it's worth the effort to get up and get something to drink. I'm sure we all been in that situation plenty of times before. So tonight, when you're in bed and you're questioning if you should get up and get some water, remember this story. So all I can hear is the clock ticking down the hallway and the muted silence. It's just way too quiet. I check the time on my cell phone. It's a few minutes short of 2:30 a.m. I then decide to sit up and get out the bed. I then make my way towards the door of my bedroom. It's really dark. I go down the hallway towards the kitchen. As I get out to the living room, I chance to look to my right and in the direction of the front door to the house. The only light is coming from a street light that is down at the end of the property and not all that far away. There, at the inside of the door, inside the house, I see this figure standing there. Its face at first appears human, then serpent-like, and then back to human, as if it can't decide how it wants to present itself to me. For some reason, I'm just standing there taking this all in. I'm not afraid, but I don't feel like I have any control over my senses either. And I'm not sure if I could move or have said anything, even if I wanted to, which at the time, I can't say I did. As the two of us are standing face to face, he assumes his human features. His face is fully painted, a thick stripe of black across his eyes, and the rest white. He has a feather woven into the hair at the top of his head. He looks young, not much older than me. He is bare-chested, not real muscular, but definitely cut. His torso is painted red. His lower half is covered in what looks to be khaki-colored pants, well worn and faded, cut off and frayed just below the knees. He is barefooted, but his wrists and ankles are wrapped with animal skin of some sort. It is hairy and light, colored like that of a coyote. He doesn't say anything to me, not aloud anyway, but I do hear his words in my head, although for the life of me, I can't remember any of it. It's as if he at the same time, with this cold stare of his, is pinching away layers of my memory. I do remember wondering why he is in my house, and having the idea that he was expecting to find someone else. Just then, without even thinking about it, my cell phone in my hand, I begin dialing 911. With the phone ringing, I look back to the painted stranger. He gives me a thin smile and vanishes through the door, which by the way is closed and locked. To the other side, I hear what sounds like a horse galloping away. I move over to the door and pull it open. I see this figure taking long strides across my yard, away from the light and out into the street. There's a car parked on the other side. He goes around to the passenger side, ducks down and into the car, and it drives off. It all happens in a matter of seconds. I then realize there's a police operator talking back to me from the phone. I tell her there was someone in my house, but I leave out the part about his changing appearance and leaving through a closed door. The operator, or whoever she was, tells me not to worry about it. She says that I'm not the first caller of this kind on this night. She tells me to say a prayer, telling me that she too is Navajo and to go back to bed and that I won't be bothered by it anymore. I was in prison for 15 years. There was a skinwalker in there with us. A little background first. I was serving a 15-year sentence in a penitentiary in South Arizona. What I was in there for isn't important, but when I was staying there were countless things that happened that no one could explain, and even more that no one wanted to know more about. It all started with a prison legend. They said that years ago, something awful and unexplainable happened in the prison. Every morning we would wake up and be expected to stand near the front of our cells, while guards visually confirmed we were present and accounted for. Apparently, about a year before I got sent there, the most brutal and unexplainable thing happened during one of those routines. A man who had a cell to himself looked very off. When the guard saw this, he pulled over another guard to help him check it out. They found it wasn't actually the prisoner they were expecting at all. It was a totally different man. And this man was wearing the skin of the other man over him. But apparently, it looked like a real monster. The scariest thing was that the guy wearing the skin was not an inmate. They had no idea how he even got into the prison. What's worse is that they couldn't even figure out who the hell he was. He wasn't documented anywhere. And what's worse than that, they never even found the body of the man of the skin he was wearing. Pretty scary stuff, I know. And I realize that's not the go-to definition of a skinwalker. But that's what the prison called him, the skinwalker. It didn't help out that the guy never talked apparently. Anyways, that's what started the whole skinwalker superstition around the yard. Apparently, the guy got shipped to a different spot about a month after it happened, and just about everyone here felt all the better for it. I heard about the story on the second day of my stay. Hell of a story to hear, to place in your home for the foreseeable future. Now, onto the real shit though. Sure, that guy was the skinwalker, but all he did in the long run was get an old Navajo inmate to tell everyone about actual skinwalkers. It seemed like a lot of the prison culture actually revolved around them. Now apparently, skinwalkers are tricky to point out on the spot, but if you manage to survive around one for more than a minute or two, almost everyone can tell the mannerisms. They can mimic human speech, but not replicate it. They twitch manically. They have an unnatural gait while walking, but apparently they got better with experience. The old Navajo guy, his name was Carl, said that he was sure there was an actual one among the prisoners, slowly picking us off over the years. He called it the Grandmaster Skinwalker at one point. Apparently he thought it had human mannerisms down so well that you might not even been able to tell if it was your cellmate for a day or two. He would expect the skinwalker to jump at any opportunity for a kill. But this one realized it had a revolving door of people to kill coming to it. A lot of guys found humor in it. A lot more were really on the edge about it. And every once in a while, in prison, people snap. Sometimes, you will find your cellmate swinging in front of the bunk, strung up around the neck by his pants. Sometimes, you just can't take it anymore. But in our yard, people tended to snap in a very special way. It wouldn't be an outburst at dinner or a silent suicide in the night. Guys would just stop talking, hunch over, and shuffle around. Any friendships they had would be mostly out the window. They would turn into a loner during rec time. They would let their hair hang in front of their face. No one liked to talk about it, like if they did, it would happen to them next. I felt the same way too. I didn't know if it was a skinwalker or people just going crazy. But I didn't want to find out. It wasn't clockwork or anything. But every time someone snapped in this way, it wasn't more than a couple weeks before they were, quote, shipped off or, quote, transferred to God knows where without anyone else knowing beforehand. Then there were nighttime occurrences. Short and a loud burst of sound echoed through my cell block during all hours of the night on a regular basis. It sounded like a mix between a pig dying squeals and nails on a chalkboard. Just another thing no one liked to talk about, even scarier, were the shadows and footsteps. The block was dimly illuminated in the night by a few lights hanging from the ceiling outside the cells. I myself saw shadows fill across my wall on a regular occasion. One time, near the end of my sentence, I woke up, looked at my back wall, and found a perfect silhouette of a person standing there. But when I looked, my bunkmate was asleep, and no one was really outside my call. And the footsteps, everyone hated the fucking footsteps. They were the scariest part. In the night, sometimes, more rarely than the shadows, you would hear ungodly, fast footsteps. They sounded like wet feet slapping on the tile floor. Whatever caused them would fly from one end of the block to the other in a dead sprint. Whatever it wasn't human-like, and it was very fast. If you happened to be awake before it started, by the time you heard the footsteps on one side of your cell and whipped your head around to see the thing run by, it sounded like it was 3 cells past you. Everyone hated those fucking footsteps. And I agree. I thought they were the worst. I was released from that place about a month ago. I have more stories than I can count. I swear it was nearly my turn. About a week before I was discharged, my cellmate and a good friend of mine snapped. In the same kind of way, I didn't sleep for an entire week. Well, I did sleep of course, but never for more than a few minutes at a time. Never turned my back on the guy. The scariest thing though, was when I woke up one night to him, somehow, snaking his body through the bars of our cell. For reference, I couldn't get anything past my shoulder through them. And the worst part of all of this was that he was coming back in to our cell. On the day of my release, I didn't say a word to him, just left, and he seemed fine with it, and so was I. I had made it through 15 years of prison fights, gang disputes, and for all I know, skinwalker abductions. I left through the front gate, a free man. As I walked along the fence for the rec yard, I spotted my cellmate, standing off on his own, similar to how he was for the last week or so. I shook my head, not even really sure if it was him anymore. I took one last look over the yard, this time from the other side of the fence, and I wish I hadn't. There, standing off on his own, on the other side of the yard, was Carl, slouched over, looking at the other inmates, and twitching manically. Isengloskagen is a forest in far north Norway. I recently moved to Laxalev for work. Even though it was January, I figured that since I was out in the wilderness, that I might as well go out into the woods to explore a bit. There wasn't a whole lot to do in town. Besides, I heard the trails in this part of the country were pretty nice. There was only a few blocks between my house and the edge of the woods. Anyways, I grabbed a bottle of water and a little bag with trail mix. I was going on a trail after all, and off I went. It had snowed the day before. I guess snow is pretty common up here. It was a pretty soft snow, the kind that ski resorts prefer. It would crunch loud as I stepped on it. Despite the trail being covered up by the snow, I was pretty confident in my ability to keep track of the trail, since the forest was somewhat dense, and the opening where the trees were removed was distinguishable, and so I wasn't worried about getting lost. It was still pretty early in the afternoon, only about 1 p.m. I wasn't worried about the sun going down. Then again, I had only moved from Virginia fairly recently, so Norway might as well have been a different planet in terms of climate and daylight. At least, that's what I thought. It might have just been a big change that I was seeing as being bigger than it was. After about half an hour, I wasn't terribly deep in the woods. I was moving at a pretty slow pace after all. I had passed a lot of scenery, but nothing that really stood out, just a lot of trees, a few which had fallen. It was at this point that I realized something that surprised me just a little bit. I wasn't alone in the woods. I stopped briefly when I noticed that a few flakes were weakly drifting to the ground, and noticed that I could hear something else. I could hear the sound of snow crunching under a human's foot. They didn't sound like they were wearing heavy boots or anything. It was much more quiet. I could only really tell it was a person because it was clearly 2 feet. They sounded distant, just barely close enough for me to actually hear it. The woods were pretty quiet. It wasn't windy or anything like that. That's when I saw her in the distance. A woman. Even though my memory is shaky, I say that she was about the ballpark of about 50 yards away. I could just barely see her moving between the trees, drifting almost casually through the snow. But something struck me about her appearance though, so I knew I had to get closer to her to know if I was right or not. So I pursued her. I didn't want to call out to her yet, but I did begin trying to hurry up. She didn't seem like she was moving very fast, but I was struggling to keep sight of her in the forest. Finally, I was about 10 yards away from her, and now I was close enough to confirm what I thought I had seen before. The woman was completely naked. I figured this woman must need help, that she must have been on something, or she was mentally ill. Nobody walks around in the snowy woods with no clothes on, with nothing on. "Excuse me," I piped up, but she didn't acknowledge me. She must have been on some serious drugs. "Excuse me," I repeated, a bit more loud this time. She kept walking, even though when I said that, her pace had slowed just a little bit. I didn't mean to stare, considering the situation, but she really was gorgeous from what I saw of her. Without going into any details, I'll just say her body and what little of her face I managed to see was damn near perfect. I shook off the distraction and began trying to approach her. I got to about 5 yards from her when she suddenly stopped. It was such a sudden thing that I stopped too. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you okay?" I asked in the best Norwegian I could, even though I knew it wasn't very good. She stood motionless in the forest for a few seconds before quickly turning to me. I then got a good look at her face. She didn't seem bothered by the cold. Her flowing blonde hair looked to have just come from a salon. Her body didn't seem to be reacting to the cold at all. No frostbite, no bluish tint, no shivering, not even one single goosebump. What really struck me about her was her eyes. Her eyes were an icy, cold-looking blue, almost gray. She had no expression, and despite having turned to me, she didn't seem to really notice that I was there. Her face and body language didn't indicate that she was actually acknowledging me. She never looked directly at me. I figured that she must really be on some serious drugs. I stopped for a second or two to think of what she might be on, before remembering her current situation. Ma'am, are you alright? I repeated. No response. I can call a hospital for you if you need me to, I offered. At that point, I realized that I didn't bring my cell phone with me. Shit, what would I do now? I had no way of contacting authorities with this drugged up naked lady in the middle of the frozen woods, but I didn't feel comfortable just leaving her out here to go and get help. What if a search team wouldn't be able to find her in time? How long has she been out here anyways? I figured that my best option would be trying to get her to follow me back to town. Ma'am, would you like my coat? I offered. It was better than just letting her freeze, after all. She didn't react to my question at all, despite the cold. I took my coat off and began to approach her. That's when I noticed something I didn't notice before. Her fingers and toes now seemed to be a blue color. She didn't seem at all frostbitten not a moment ago. Where did that come from so fast? I knew I had to get her out of here, and fast. As I got closer, there was more frostbite I hadn't noticed before on her nose and ears. Suddenly, she turned away from me and began walking away. Hey, wait! I called out to her. No response. Suddenly, her pace quickened. A few seconds later, she was running. And a few seconds after that, she was out of sight. Damn it, I shouted. I would have to try to follow her footprints in the snow now. But that's when I noticed that she wasn't leaving any footprints. What the hell was going on here? A naked lady walking aimlessly in the middle of a Norwegian winter with randomly appearing frostbite, and she wasn't leaving any footprints? Was she on drugs? Or was I? I thought about just turning back and trying to go back to town, but I still thought it would be better to find her and lead her back. I would just grab her and carry or drag her if necessary. I wasn't gonna let this lady freeze to death while I could do something about it, even if she was apparently levitating. It was then at that point that I realized that I didn't know where I was. In my attempts to get to her, I had lost track of the trail. Well, now I felt stupid. My own footprints, I thought. I turned around and found that my footprints were also gone. My trail now just started where I was standing at the moment. Had the snow filled them in, or was I going crazy? I know for a fact, though, that I wasn't levitating. It was at this revelation that I was becoming afraid. Something was, seriously, wrong here. What could I do now? I didn't know where the lady was anymore, and I didn't know how to get back to town, even if I did find her. This place is a big expanse of forest. It eventually extends back to a mountain range. Unfortunately, the trees were too thick to see the mountains for reference. Where the fuck was I? I could see one thing, however. The sun was starting to go down. The sun goes down pretty early around here. I guess it was a mistake to go out this late, since I figured I would have been home by now. I decided that all I could really do was just start walking the same direction I thought I had come from. I picked the direction that had been directly behind me when I lost sight of the woman. I figured that if I could find the trail, it would be easy. But I felt terrible leaving her that way. But I needed to know where the hell I was before I could effectively help her. I was now considering just rushing home and calling the authorities to be the best available option. But first, I needed to find home. I walked for what felt like hours, through snow and trees, without ever finding the trail. I didn't know if my mind was playing tricks on me, similar to my footprints disappearing, or if I had actually gone in the wrong direction. I paused to look around when I noticed a woman walking off in the distance. Relative to where I was, she was at 3:30, about 20 yards away. I stared at her for a few seconds, realizing that she was actually looking at me. The fact that she was looking at me was creepier than when she wasn't. I was frozen in place, too confused to approach her. I knew I needed to help her, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to anymore. All of this seemed so off. She then began taking a few slow steps towards me, to where I was. I don't know why, but I was getting scared now. I took a few steps back to attempt to match the ground she was gaining on me. She didn't seem determined to get to me. In fact, despite looking at me, she didn't seem like she actually noticed me. I was, for some reason, apprehensive to turn away from her and just run. I was still clinging to the idea that this was just some normal woman, out of her mind, on drugs, who also needed my help. My own pace was beginning to slow down. I don't know why, but I wanted to get away from her, for some reason. But my body just wasn't moving the way it should have been. On top of that, I was so cold, it was like ice was forming in my blood, and she was catching up to me pretty quickly. "Ma'am, if you need help, I can help you," I said. "We can get back to town. Lakasalev, you know where that is, right? It's just on the outside of the woods here. Do you want me to help you?" No response. I looked down and noticed that her hands and feet were frostbitten. There was also patches of frostbite all over her body now. Had her condition become more severe? When she got closer, the frostbite was also on her lips, turning them a blue color. Her chest and face were slowly becoming flushed in a frosty blue. "Ma'am, your frostbite is getting worse. We need to get you to town. Here, take my coat," I said. I was actually becoming panicked at her bizarre behavior and this entire situation. There really was something severely wrong here. A large clump of snow fell from a branch above my head and crashed on my head. It didn't hurt, but I had to wipe the snow from my eyes. It took little effort getting it out. I looked up from my struggle to notice her now standing very close to me, nearly 3 feet away. That's when I lost it. I began to will myself away from her. I took off running, not caring which way I was heading anymore. As long as I could get away from that monster, that thing. She wasn't human, or if she was, she wasn't a normal human. When I looked up at her that time, her body was completely covered in frostbite. Her entire skin was a deep blue color, patches of decay. Her forearms down and her legs on down were skeletal. Her face was mutilated by frostbite. Her ears and nose missing, the rims of her lips missing. Her chest was actually missing entirely, with a large patch of mutilation carved into her chest by frostbite, exposing just a small amount of her rib cage. I was just about out of my mind. I was actually running now. I had no idea where I would end up. I was just hoping to find the edge of the woods before she might have found me. I couldn't tell at all if I was getting closer to safety or further into the woods. Then I kind of wondered if just escaping the woods would be enough. Would she follow me out? I didn't know what to think anymore. That thing, obviously, wasn't human anymore, assuming it ever really was. So I didn't even know if it would conform to human logic. All I could do was cycle through begging not to be found, begging to escape somewhere else, begging to escape somewhere safe, cursing my entire decision to go walking out in the woods, cursing the woods themselves, asking what the hell she was. All of this, it was all I could do while running to avoid going crazy. I don't know what's going on. Maybe it was making the whole thing worse. I ran for what must have been another few hours, and it was dark now. As I was running, I tripped over a root, steered sideways, and slammed my back into a tree. It was now too dark for me to see anything, and I was now too tired to even move. If she were to find me, that's all there was to it. I would have to rest, build up some strength. I backed myself up against the tree I had collided with and stared into the blackness, hoping not to get attacked. I remember the food I brought with me and pulled out my bottle of water. All of the liquid had frozen solid. I found it very strange because I didn't really think it was cold enough for that to happen, especially since it had been in my coat pocket the entire time. Maybe I was going crazy, or maybe I was just losing it. Well, I couldn't drink ice, so I moved on to the trail mix. It was fine and gave me a bit of strength. Stopping to eat actually gave me the chance to try to collect myself. I could really only wonder what the fuck that thing was. Why I was seeing so many weird things going on with the snow and ice. There had to be some kind of connection, but I wasn't about to approach any solid ideas as to what it was. As I sat in the dark, I could hear snow crunching somewhere. It was pitch black, but I could tell it was somewhere to my right. I was too exhausted to move now. All I could really do was sit against the tree and hope she didn't find me, or at least hope that whatever she would do to me wouldn't be too bad. But for some reason I doubted that. When I looked at her back then, she was looking at me for just a second. When I could see what she really was, that frostbitten body, her eyes stayed, but they were glazed over, like she was drugged or something. For just a second she looked right at me. I can't even think of what she might have wanted to do to me, but I'm not really liking any of my options right now. As I sat there, listening to the distant crunching, I focused so intently. I could feel every single snowflake that was hitting me. They seemed to be getting colder, somehow. The entire forest seemed to be dropping in temperature. I honestly wasn't sure I would live to see her catch me. I might end up freezing first. I was trying to think that maybe I shouldn't just be sitting here, but I couldn't decide which was more dangerous, walking around hoping not to be found, or sitting in one spot hoping not to be found. I wasn't sure what to do either way. I looked behind the tree to still see nothing in the dark. I was pretty quickly darting my eyes and head around, desperately trying to get a visual on something, anything. I couldn't even see the tree I was leaning against. It must have been a new moon or something. I was so paranoid. I was pretty quickly losing track of time. I had no idea what time it might be, but things were starting to get blurry. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because out of nowhere, I opened my eyes to see broad daylight. In hindsight, I kinda wish I'd been able to stay awake. Even though nothing happened, something easily could have. In fact, whatever that thing was, seemed to have such a good grasp on the woods. I'm actually surprised she didn't find me. The only thing I can really think of is that she must have found me, but thought it would be too easy if I was sleeping when she did it. I looked to my right and saw footprints in the snow. Not a trail, just two footprints, side by side, like somebody was hovering over me, landed right there, and flew away. Was she watching me the entire night? Fuck that. I think that might actually be worse than if she caught me, 'cause now I know she's toying with me. I'm not sure if she considered me more prey or a toy, but I didn't like either option. Now that it was morning and I had rested, I decided I needed to start running again, trying to find the trail, the edge of the woods, anything. Honestly, I was sore as hell from all that running, but I guess I couldn't avoid more of it. I started off at a slow walk, keeping my eyes out for whatever that thing might be. This was a bit difficult, since I wanted desperately to just take off and run. I had to think about where I was going, instead of just zipping around blindly. I thought of looking for moss on trees, since I knew the woods were to the southeast of town. Conveniently, the trees had no moss at all, nor did the nearby rocks. I tried to think back on where the sun set last night, but I wasn't awake to see it rise, and I was running so blindly I didn't notice where it set. The sun was currently to my left, but I didn't know what time it was, or what direction that was, so that was worthless. I wish I was an expert tracker. I'm sure some hunter or navigator would be able to get me out of the woods. So now, I just had to walk, hoping I was going in the right direction, hoping I wouldn't run into that thing again. I walked for a while, what had to be about 2 hours or so. I still didn't seem to be anywhere near the edge of the woods. I still couldn't see anything. It was mostly just a flat plain of snow with trees all around it. I kinda wish they had put a sign up at the edge of the woods, warning people not to go into it. Then again, I'm pretty sure a sign that said, "Warning, naked zombie lady," would be dismissed as a joke. At this point, I realized I was stupid and just ate a handful of snow. I completely forgot that snow was just fluffy water, and just went without liquid because my water bottle was frozen. I must have been so confused from where I was exhausted that I didn't even think of it. With that refresher, I began to realize I was being followed again. I could hear the snow crunching from behind me again. I turned to face it, but there was nothing there. I gazed around, but still couldn't see anything. I needed to hurry up before that thing caught up to me, so I got up and kept moving. It was hours later, and I still didn't see any scenery that looked even remotely unique. I had no idea these woods were this big. I realized that nobody really knew me, so nobody would be looking for me either way. I wasn't really counting on that anyways. Honestly, I just needed to find a way out. At this rate, I wasn't sure if I was just walking in circles or not. I could have been for all I knew. At this point, I realized the sun was hanging low. That must have been west. I knew I needed to go northwest, so all I had to do was head in some direction from there. I didn't know where I would come out, but it was worth the shot, so I started walking. I walked for several more hours in what I assumed was a straight line. It didn't seem to be taking me anywhere. I looked up trying to focus on the sun, trying to see which way I was going. Around then, I turned around to see the path where I was coming from. That's when I saw her, the woman, standing directly across from me. She was far enough away that I couldn't see if there was any frostbite on her this time. She didn't look like it, but she was staring directly at me and walking towards me. I was in a better position this time, or at least I thought. I knew where the hell I was going. I turned left and started running towards the sun. I knew that there was a highway that went through a part of the woods. I wasn't so intent on getting to the highway as my definite destination. If she blocks my path directly to town, I can find some semblance of civilization. I ran for a few minutes before realizing that I had lost her, or at least it looked like I did. I wasn't sure anymore. I knew she could be anywhere. I slowed to a stop and surveyed my surroundings. I couldn't see her anywhere, nor any sign of her. A small amount of sunlight was peeking through the trees now, but I could tell it would most likely be setting within the hour. I had to find my way out before that happened. Otherwise, I would lose my only usable reference point. I took off running again, sprinting through the forest, dodging between trees. I had no idea how long I was running for, maybe 45 minutes, but it was also getting darker. I was losing light and my ability to navigate. I could only try to keep running in a single direction, then just keep going that same way once the sun was down. I felt I had a pretty good system now. Surely, I couldn't get lost if I kept in a straight line. The only thing I really had to worry about was getting interrupted. At that point, I crashed into a tree. I had been running for hours. I must have been tired again. My coat wasn't really protecting me from the environment the way it should have been also. As I slowly rose to my feet, I saw an opening in the trees. It was the trail. I had finally found it again. I climbed back to 2 feet and staggered onto it. I felt a lot better knowing I had found a sign that I was on the right track. I then realized I had something of a conundrum. Should I really follow the trail, or should I keep going in a straight line the way I was? I remember seeing a map of the trail outside, seeing that it wasn't just one trail, but a huge network. I don't remember any specific directions, but I knew that just blindly following the trail might not necessarily be a good idea, especially now that I was already on a good path. I decided the trail could screw itself and kept walking in a straight line. It was also very dark now. I could barely see. I couldn't quite move as quickly as I was before, but I wasn't about to just stop. I didn't trust my safety to that monster. It was now practically pitch black again. I didn't know what time it must have been. I had been switching between walking and running for more than 24 hours now. When the fuck would these woods end? These woods couldn't have been this expansive. They just couldn't have been. I must have been just completely lost at this point. I didn't know what to think at that point, and I still didn't know, to be honest. I was lost in thought, and then I realized the sun went down. The night wasn't quite as dark as the night before, but it was still nearly pitch black. I wouldn't just be running blindly anymore, so I kept walking straight. I felt in front of me for trees, groping blindly like an idiot. I must have looked like one to that sadistic bitch. I went on grabbing at nothing for several hours. It had to be past midnight when I felt something that wasn't natural. I felt a quick brush of a wispy, spiderweb-like form. It was hair. That woman's hair. That thing's hair. I stepped back for a second. Looking around in the darkness, I couldn't see her anywhere. I could just barely make out the trees around me. I stood mostly blind, helpless against this monster in the dark. At this point, not being able to see her was worse than actually seeing her. That paranoia that grips you as a little kid in your bedroom, staring at the closet, waiting for the boogeyman to come out and eat you. I finally took a step, not feeling any sign of her anywhere. I kept taking a few very slow steps, trying to make some kind of headway. At this rate, I wasn't sure I would even notice if I was out of the woods or not. I could be standing in a field and I might not really notice. I debunked all of this when I felt the bark of a tree in front of me. I began maneuvering around it, keeping at its base to avoid losing my direction. As I rounded the trunk, I felt something. I felt two icy cold, skeletal hands lightly caressed the sides of my neck. I felt what must have been, whatever the fuck that thing was. Its shredded lips lightly kissed my ear. At that moment, I fucking lost it. I turned around, took a swing, hitting nothing, and turned back, taking off running. Kinda funny how quickly I abandoned my plan of just staying slow. I have no idea what the fuck that thing wanted, but it wouldn't be getting it from me. I sprinted through the woods, occasionally bumping into the edge of a tree, heading where I prayed, which was northwest. I was in a full panic, just barely keeping it together enough to remember where I was supposed to be going. It was a flashback to the night before, where I just ran blindly and got myself lost as I was. At least now, I could hope I had stayed in the right direction this time, but I wasn't banking on it. I had to avoid trees in the dark, hoping that lady wasn't behind me or in front of me. But that might be the thing that made me panic the most. The idea that I would just run right into her in the dark and never see her coming. I couldn't shake that feeling. I never felt like she wasn't right next to me. I knew she was always somewhere close by, watching me, waiting for whatever she wanted from me. At some point in the dark, I suddenly ran right into something. It was low and hard. It seemed to be a big rock. I felt one of my shin bones shatter on contact from how hard I was running, combined with the shape of it. I went flying over it, rode over the top of it, and landed in what seemed to be a collection of smaller rocks. I then started groping my way around before finding my footing. The rocks I was standing on were loose, so I ended up falling again. My hand landed just the right way for me to get an idea of the rock itself. It felt so strange. It actually didn't seem like stone. It was too light for that. I picked it up and felt its shape, discovering it to be a bone. I felt around a bit more and found that all of the small rocks I was laying on were actually bones, some of them clearly human. I began trying to crawl my way out before brushing my head on something metallic. I picked it up, finding it to be an old lighter. I gave it a few clicks to see if it worked. I have no idea if it did, since I was terrible with lighters. I never could get one to light up. As I sat there, I felt something brush against my leg. It was a hand. I jumped back, assuming it was her. As I backed away, I heard what I can only describe as a hoarse, weak, wheezing noise. I grabbed a large rock, crawling over it, attempting to rest for energy. I wasn't sure how well I could do with that busted leg bone. As I sat back, I could hear snow crunching from behind me. I listened carefully, trying to see exactly where it was coming from. How close was it? It was in the bone pile, apparently. The footsteps suddenly stopped, as I heard total silence for a few seconds. The wheezing kicked back, more panic sounding this time, like a person who had their vocal cords cut desperately, trying to talk. I suddenly began hearing a different crunching noise. It sounded like bone breaking. It sounded like flesh tearing. I didn't know what was worse, what was happening, or what might be happening, and not knowing was killing me. I had to know what it was. Curiosity was driving me crazy, even though I dreaded what the answer to my question might be. Finally, I decided I had to see. I peeked over the rock, seeing nothing but darkness, of course. But then I remembered the lighter. I gave it a few flicks before finally getting the damn thing to light. When I looked down, I saw her. I now saw the full scope of the bone pile. It was huge. It looked almost like one of those mass graves that genocides and massacres have been known to produce. There were some animal bones too, deer, birds, dogs, but it seemed like it was mostly human bones. As I looked closely, I saw tooth marks on the bones. As I looked up, I saw exactly what she was doing, the exact source of that noise. It was a man. It looked to be a middle-aged man, or at least what was left of him. His body was missing from around his stomach down. She was holding his torso up, devouring him. She was biting off organs and flesh, breaking bone with her teeth, where it had once wore its disguise as a normal woman, attempting to maintain a sort of dignity or beauty. All of it had mostly been abandoned. Its mouth opened too wide, mostly due to what seemed to be her cheeks missing, as she tore off huge chunks of flesh like an animal. She then looked up at me, giving me a frigid look with those eyes. She glared at me, her female dignity returning. She stood, her mouth covered in frozen blood. The man seemed to be fading quickly. His body was blue from frostbite. I have no idea how he was still alive, but he most likely wouldn't be for much longer. As she approached me, she took further notice of the lighter I carried. She seemed to shy away from me when she saw it, like she was afraid of it, but she still approached me, slowly, inching closer. As she approached, I realized what it was. Everything about her was cold. Her body was cold. Her home was cold. Her victims were cold. Her food was cold, so anything with heat must have been something she can't deal with. As she was within arm's reach, I thrust the lighter at her. She quickly backed away before continuing her approach. I tried this a few more times before realizing that I was right. She couldn't stand heat. At this point, I had a crazy idea that I must have gotten from an action movie. I figured that if she was afraid or weakened by heat, I could set her on fire and possibly be done with her for good. As well as I could, I kept the lighter lit up and gently tossed it at her. reaching right into her hair lightly catching a slight bit of fire before the lighter faded out onto the ground. I couldn't see what was happening, just embers coming from her, apparently burning her hair. I didn't want to stick around. This thing didn't seem to be very mortal, so I didn't want to risk the idea that I had only pissed it off. As best as I could with my busted up leg, I took off running, which actually wasn't very fast, more like limping away, but it was fast enough. I didn't see any really convincing signs that she was following me, but I'll never be sure. Everything after that is just kind of blurry. I have no clue how long I must have been running. It seemed almost like I must have fallen asleep while running, because suddenly I was reaching the highway, staggering out onto the pavement and collapsing. At this point, I blacked out. What happened between then and when I woke up in the hospital was extremely fuzzy. I must have been picked up by somebody at some point, but I don't remember who they were or when they came along. What I do remember was coming to my senses for a few seconds in somebody's car, or it might have been the cab of a truck. The person asked me who I was, and I answered. They asked me what I was doing out in the woods and what happened to me. For all I know, I blacked out again before I could answer. I woke up in the hospital in the afternoon. The doctors and police were asking me what happened to me. I didn't mention the bones, fearing that by doing so, I would end up sending some police officers to their death. I just told them that I had gone for a walk in the woods and became hopelessly lost. One officer asked me about the marks on my body. Apparently, when the woman touched me, she left marks of frostbite on my neck in the shape of skeletal hands. That's when I told them that I had no idea how that came to be. They didn't really seem to press the issue after that. I got home a few days later. I started my job a few days after that. I wasn't really that great in Norwegian, but had a passing knowledge of it. I asked a few coworkers about the woods, about that forest. An older guy told me about the woods being haunted by something, but he didn't really elaborate, and I don't think I really needed him to, since I knew all that I needed to know about it. On some occasions, I feel like I'm still sometimes back there, when I get a sudden chilly draft in my house, and the feeling that I'm being watched. Even in the summer, even after I have moved out the country, which, once again for work, the frostbite she left on my neck left a very visible scar. It still does hurt a little bit, especially on cold, snowy days. I don't recommend ever going there, not even for a second. I don't know what that thing was, where she came from, or if she even survived my attack. I was lucky to have gotten away, because I know that if I hadn't found that lighter, I would most likely have ended up the same as that guy. I do still warn you though, that if you ever do decide to go, I can't promise that you'll do any better than I did. And to all the men out there, if you ever see a naked woman out in the woods, don't ever approach her. As a matter of fact, run, turn the other way, and run opposite of her as fast as you can.